It's funny how they say volunteering brings couples closer together. In my case, it brought my wife closer to a man named Chad, who, I'm convinced, was born wearing a Patagonia vest and holding a craft beer. What started as a small-town political campaign turned into a scandal big enough to make our neighbors whisper behind their fences. And yes, before you ask, I've changed everyone's names here because I don't need a lawsuit on top of my current headache. Anyway, here's how it all began. My wife, let's call her Rachel, has always been someone who thrives on projects. When the kids left for college, she took up pottery, gardening, and even briefly tried her hand at writing a cozy mystery novel. But none of those hobbies stuck for long. That's why I didn't think much of it when she became obsessed with this guy, Evan Gray, a young, charismatic candidate running for mayor in our town. She was captivated by his speeches about renewable energy and community unity. To me, it all sounded like a bunch of buzzwords, but Rachel was eating it up. At first, her involvement in the campaign seemed harmless. She volunteered at the phone bank, organized yard sign deliveries, and went to their weekly strategy meetings. I was happy she'd found something to keep herself busy. Plus, she came home glowing, which in hindsight should have been my first red flag. She hadn't been that energized since her book club days back when she was sneaking sips of wine between chapters. Things took a turn when she started staying late at the campaign office. "There's so much to do," she'd say, tossing her tote bag over her shoulder and rushing out the door like a political savior. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, the campaign was heating up, and I figured it was normal for volunteers to put in extra hours. But then the receipts started to pile up. Fancy coffee runs, late-night strategy dinners, and one particularly interesting Uber charge from a downtown hotel to our house. I told myself I was being paranoid. Rachel had never been anything but loyal. We've been married for 22 years, and though we'd hit a few rough patches, who hasn't? I always believed we were solid. But then I started noticing the way she talked about Chad. He was the campaign manager, a man who looked like he lived at CrossFit and used words like synergy unironically. According to Rachel, Chad was brilliant, passionate, and completely devoted to Evan Gray's vision for the town. She mentioned him so often it felt like I knew the guy personally. It wasn't until I stumbled across an article about the campaign in our local paper that I started to piece things together. There was Rachel front and center in a photo with Chad and Evan, holding a clipboard and looking like she'd won the lottery. But it wasn't her smile that caught my attention. It was the way Chad was standing next to her, just a little too close for comfort. Suddenly, all those late nights and glowing smiles didn't seem so innocent. And that's where I'll leave things for now. Trust me, it gets worse. Much worse. The photo in the paper stuck in my mind like a bad jingle you can't stop humming. Rachel looked radiant, standing between Chad and Evan Gray like she'd been part of their campaign forever. I told myself I was overthinking it, that there was nothing wrong with her looking happy. But the way Chad stood so close to her, leaning in just enough to make his presence felt, it gnawed at me. Still, I let it slide, for the moment. But the moment didn't last long. Rachel's newfound enthusiasm for politics wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was ramping up. Her evenings at the campaign office turned into entire Saturdays spent at events. She'd come home, buzzing about canvassing strategies, high-profile endorsements, and the incredible team she was working with. I noticed how her descriptions of Chad grew more glowing by the day. He was smart, funny, and a real leader. She was practically writing his LinkedIn recommendations in her head. Then came the second odd thing. Rachel started dressing differently. She'd always been practical, favoring comfortable jeans and sneakers for errands and her usual weekend routines. But now, she was pulling out tailored blazers, heels, and makeup just to go to the campaign office. "First impressions matter," she'd said with a laugh when I asked why she was so dressed up. I laughed too, but inside, I felt like someone was rearranging the furniture in a room I'd lived in for 22 years. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I was raised to believe that you trust the people you love unless they give you a reason not to. So I watched and waited, hoping that my gut feeling was wrong. And then I found the ticket stub. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, and I was tidying up the kitchen while Rachel was out at yet another strategy session. She wasn't usually one to leave things lying around, but when I picked up her tote bag from the chair, a small piece of paper fluttered out. I bent down to pick it up, thinking it was some campaign flyer or a receipt. But no, It was a ticket stub for a concert in the city, a show that had taken place 3 weeks earlier. Now, here's the thing. Rachel isn't a concert person. She's the type who complains about how loud the music is at restaurants. And as far as I knew, she hadn't mentioned anything about going to a concert. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. Had it been a group outing with a campaign team? A gift from someone? Or something else entirely? I checked the date on the stub against her planner, the one she always kept meticulously updated on the kitchen counter. Sure enough, the concert date lined up with one of the starred entries. No explanation, no notes, just a gold star marking the day. The pieces started to come together in my mind like a slow-moving train wreck. The late nights, the overly enthusiastic praise for Chad, the sudden wardrobe upgrades, and now this mysterious concert ticket. I wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, but the evidence was piling up, and none of it looked good. I started to notice other small details, too. Her usual perfume was replaced with something new and expensive. She seemed distracted, like her mind was elsewhere even when we were sitting in the same room. And then there was the car. A faint smell of cologne that wasn't mine clung to the passenger seat, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. But now I was looking for everything. Still, I couldn't bring myself to confront her. Not yet. If I was wrong, I'd be the paranoid husband who couldn't handle his wife having a life outside our marriage. But if I was right, well, I needed to be sure. That's when I made the decision to follow her. I didn't want to. The idea made me feel like I was betraying her in some way. But the doubt was eating away at me, and I couldn't live with it any longer. So the next time she left for one of her strategy sessions, I waited a few minutes, grabbed my keys, and got in my car. I had no idea what I was about to find, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my life was about to change. I wasn't sure what I expected to find when I followed Rachel that evening. A group of volunteers in a fluorescent-lit office? Maybe a late-night coffee shop meeting with Chad? Leaning a little too close but still technically innocent? What I didn't expect was where she ended up, or what I found once she got there. She left the house in her usual campaign-ready outfit. Blazer heels, hair pulled into a perfect bun. I waited a few minutes before heading out, keeping my distance as her taillights disappeared down the road. She took a route I didn't recognize, weaving out of the neighborhoods and toward the edge of town. I assumed she was heading to the campaign office, but when she turned onto a narrow road that led to a private event venue outside the city, my stomach dropped. This place wasn't just any venue. It was the kind of spot you booked for high-end fundraisers, weddings, or private parties, tucked away behind a gated driveway and surrounded by sprawling oak trees. The kind of place that didn't scream Grassroots campaign. I parked on the side of the road, far enough back that I wouldn't be noticed, and watched as Rachel's car disappeared behind the gates. A small sign out front read, "Private event, invitation only." My first instinct was to drive away, pretend I hadn't seen anything. But curiosity, or maybe desperation, got the better of me. I parked further down, hopped out, and walked up the dark edge of the driveway, sticking close to the tree line. Through the gaps in the branches, I saw sleek black cars parked in neat rows and a cluster of people standing under strings of golden lights. It wasn't until I got closer that I realized this wasn't just a gathering of campaign volunteers. The people mingling were well-dressed, sipping champagne and holding envelopes. Rachel was there too, standing in the center of the crowd, holding what looked like a clipboard. At first, it all seemed normal. Maybe this was some high-level donor event that hadn't been mentioned in the campaign flyers. But then I noticed something strange. No one was handing over donations. Instead, they were passing Rachel and another man sealed envelopes and walking away with what looked like plain black boxes. I squinted to get a better look. It wasn't until one of the boxes caught the light that I saw a shiny emblem stamped across the top. Not the campaign logo, but a corporate logo I recognized from recent news headlines. It was the logo of a company that had been in the middle of a scandal just weeks earlier, a pharmaceutical company accused of price gouging life-saving medications. Their CEO had resigned in disgrace, and their reputation was in shambles. What the hell was Rachel doing accepting envelopes from people affiliated with them? And why was Chad standing next to her, laughing and clinking glasses like this was a cocktail party and not some shady backroom deal? The scene unfolded like something out of a political drama. People came and went quickly, slipping in and out of the venue without lingering. Rachel looked completely at ease, smiling and shaking hands, as if she'd done this 100 times. I ducked lower, trying to stay hidden as I watched her place a black box into her car before returning to the crowd. My mind raced with questions. Was this part of the campaign? Did Evan Gray know about this? Or was this some off-the-books operation Chad and Rachel were running? And most importantly, what had my wife gotten herself into? I waited until the crowd thinned out before creeping closer. The venue doors were still open, and I could hear Chad's voice inside, laughing as he joked about the beauty of plausible deniability. I felt sick. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just infidelity, it was something bigger, something darker, and Rachel was right in the middle of it. I stayed long enough to see her leave, but I didn't follow her home. I needed time to think, to process what I'd just seen. I drove back to the house and sat in the driveway for what felt like hours, replaying the scene over and over in my head. The Rachel I knew, the Rachel who baked cookies for the neighbors and cried during Christmas movies, wouldn't be involved in something like this. Or would she? And that's when it hit me. I had been so focused on the possibility of Rachel cheating that I hadn't stopped to consider what else she might be hiding. This wasn't just a betrayal of me. It was a betrayal of everything I thought I knew about her. I had stumbled onto something much bigger than an affair, and I had no idea how deep it went. By the time Rachel came home that night, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cold beer in hand and a storm brewing in my chest. But I didn't say a word. She breezed through the door, humming to herself, and tossed her tote bag onto the counter. "Great event tonight," she said casually before disappearing upstairs. I just stared at the condensation pooling on the beer bottle, wondering how the woman I'd been married to for 22 years could lie so easily. I decided not to confront her yet. I needed more information, something concrete to make sense of what I'd seen. If this was just about an affair, I could have chalked it up to midlife crisis cliches. New clothes, late nights, suspicious absences. But black boxes, pharmaceutical logos, and envelopes filled with God knows what? That wasn't just infidelity. That was something that could ruin lives. The next day, I called in sick to work. I'm not proud of what I did, but I started combing through Rachel's things while she was out. She had a predictable routine. Morning coffee with her favorite pumpkin spice creamer, a trip to the gym, then a few hours at the campaign office. It gave me a solid window of time. I started with her tote bag. It was full of the usual: campaign flyers, a half-empty water bottle, a pack of gum. But tucked into the side pocket, I found something that made my stomach twist. A badge with her name on it, labeled Event Coordinator, from an upscale downtown hotel. I recognized the name instantly. It's the kind of place you only go to for high-end conferences, or if you're like me, a wedding you can barely afford. I Googled the event. It had taken place 2 weeks earlier. A private reception for industry leaders in healthcare innovation. The pharmaceutical company's name was plastered all over the event materials, along with a list of speakers that included some big-shot lobbyists. And guess who else had been there? Chad. His name was listed as a panelist for a discussion on community partnerships. Suddenly, everything started to click. This wasn't just a local campaign. It was a network of people making deals that had nothing to do with bettering our town. And Rachel was in the middle of it. But it wasn't just Rachel's tote bag that revealed things. When I went into the garage, I found her campaign bin, a big plastic storage box where she kept leftover signs, stickers, and event supplies. It looked normal enough, but when I moved some of the materials aside, I found something odd. A thin stack of papers bound with a rubber band. They weren't campaign flyers. They were invoices. At first glance, they didn't seem out of place. Just receipts for event rentals and catering. But the numbers didn't make sense. One invoice showed an expense for promotional materials that totaled $15,000, an absurd amount for a Grassroots campaign. Another listed consulting services from a company I'd never heard of, billed for nearly $20,000. There was even one for transportation logistics, which seemed innocent enough until I saw the signature at the bottom. Chad's. I don't know why, but I couldn't stop myself. I grabbed my phone and snapped photos of every page. It felt wrong, invasive even, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel was involved in something much worse than a fling. The final clue came later that afternoon. I drove past the campaign office, curious to see if Rachel's car was there. It wasn't. Instead, it was parked in front of a coffee shop across town. I pulled into a spot down the block and watched from the rearview mirror as she sat at a table by the window. She wasn't alone. Chad was there, leaning across the table, his hand resting casually on her wrist. They were laughing, sharing something on a laptop, completely oblivious to the world around them. But it wasn't their intimacy that shocked me the most. It was what was on the laptop screen. From my angle, I could make out just enough to see a spreadsheet open, full of numbers and names. At the top, in bold letters, was a word that made my blood run cold. PAC contributions. For those who don't know, PACs, political action committees, are organizations that funnel money into campaigns. They're legal, sure, but they're also notorious for shady dealings and backroom agreements. And if Rachel and Chad were managing something like that, it meant this wasn't just about a campaign anymore. It was about power, influence, and a level of corruption I never thought I'd see in my own backyard. I drove home in a daze, trying to wrap my head around everything I'd uncovered. My wife wasn't just cheating on me. She was part of something much bigger, something that could destroy not just our marriage, but everything she claimed to stand for. I wasn't sure what to do next. Call the cops? The local newspaper? Or confront her directly and risk her denying everything? One thing was certain. This wasn't the Rachel I thought I knew. And I wasn't going to sit back and let her drag me into whatever mess she'd gotten herself into. By this point, I wasn't just suspicious. I was certain. Rachel was knee-deep in something rotten, and I wasn't going to let her make a fool out of me any longer. It wasn't just about the affair or the shady deals. It was the sheer audacity of it all. She was walking around like everything was fine, coming home to me every night with that same cheery smile, while secretly playing a dangerous game. I needed proof. Real, undeniable proof, not just for my peace of mind, but for what came next. The first thing I did was make copies of everything I'd found. The invoices from her campaign bin, the photos of her and Chad at the coffee shop, and the receipts she'd carelessly left behind. I used a cheap scanner I'd bought years ago for tax purposes, uploading everything onto a USB drive and keeping it hidden in the garage, tucked inside an old toolbox she'd never touch. But I knew I needed more, something that couldn't be brushed off as coincidence or misinterpretation. That's when I decided to go back to the venue I'd followed her to. It was risky, sure, but I couldn't let it go. I waited until the weekend, when Rachel told me she'd be canvassing all day with volunteers. As soon as she left, I drove to the venue, hoping they'd have something I could use. The place was empty, but the main office was open, so I walked in and pretended to be interested in booking the space for a family reunion. The woman at the front desk was happy to oblige, showing me around and explaining the rental process. I made small talk, nodding along as she described catering packages and deposit fees. But my real goal was to find out who had rented the space that night. "Do you host a lot of political events here?" I asked casually, trying not to sound too eager. "Oh, all the time," she replied, flipping through a binder of past bookings. "We had a great one a few weeks ago. Really upscale. I think it was for that mayoral candidate, Evan Gray. They rented out the whole property." "Bingo. Wow, sounds fancy," I said, trying to sound impressed. "Do you keep records of those events? In case I want to do something similar?" She hesitated, but then shrugged. "Sure, we keep records for billing. Hold on a sec." She left the room briefly and returned with a file folder labeled with the date of the event. I pretended to glance over it, but inside, I was memorizing every detail. The client's name, a corporate consulting firm I didn't recognize. The payment method, a wire transfer from an account that wasn't tied to the campaign, and a list of services provided, including discrete entry arrangements and security. Before she could get suspicious, I thanked her and left, making a mental note of everything I'd seen. The next step was trickier. I needed to get into Rachel's computer. She was always careful about her passwords, but luckily for me, she wasn't as careful as she thought. She used the same password for everything, a combination of our wedding anniversary and the kids' birth dates. I waited until she left her laptop open on the dining table one evening and took my chance. Her emails were exactly what I expected. There were dozens of messages between her and Chad, many of them encrypted, but the unencrypted ones were revealing enough. They talked about donor management, special deliveries, and even reference payments being funneled through third parties. One email stood out. a forwarded receipt for a luxury hotel stay in the city, addressed to both her and Chad, dated the night of the concert I'd found the ticket stub for. I screenshotted everything and added it to my growing archive. The USB drive was filling up fast, but I wasn't done yet. I needed to be absolutely sure that when the time came, there would be no escape for her, or Chad. The final piece fell into place when I stumbled upon something I hadn't expected, a burner phone. I found it in the glove compartment of her car while pretending to check the tire pressure one morning. It was cheap, one of those prepaid models you could pick up at any Walmart. At first, I thought it might belong to one of the kids, but when I powered it on, the messages made it clear whose it was. The texts were a goldmine. Chad's name appeared over and over, along with other numbers I didn't recognize. There were references to meetings at the cabin, no idea where that was, vague mentions of the shipment, and one chilling message that read, "If anyone asks, stick to the story. We can't afford mistakes right now." I copied everything from the phone onto the USB drive, then put it back exactly where I found it. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control. By the end of that week, I had everything I needed: photos, documents, emails, texts, receipts. It wasn't just proof of an affair. It was proof of something bigger, something corrupt. And now, it was time to decide what to do with it. Rachel thought she could keep her double life hidden. She thought I was oblivious. But the truth was, I had been watching, waiting, and planning. And when I made my move, it would be decisive, calculated, and devastating. When I decided to take my revenge, I wasn't interested in petty payback. I didn't want screaming matches or dramatic confrontations. Rachel and Chad weren't just cheating. They were breaking laws, betraying trust, and playing with fire. So, I made sure my response would burn their entire house of cards to the ground. First, I polished up my collection of evidence. The USB drive was my crown jewel, loaded with everything: the invoices, emails, burner phone texts, photos, and receipts. It was airtight. Even the most skilled lawyer couldn't spin their way out of what I'd uncovered. But I wasn't stopping there. I wanted Rachel and Chad to face the consequences publicly, where it would hurt the most. Step one was the campaign. Evan Gray's entire political platform was built on transparency and community trust. What do you think happens to a candidate when their campaign manager and top volunteer are exposed as fraudsters and liars? Exactly. I crafted an anonymous email to Evan's PR team, attaching the most damning evidence: the burner phone messages about the shipment, the financial discrepancies in the invoices, and the photos of Rachel and Chad at their private meetings. I kept the email short and professional. "Dear Mr. Gray, I thought you want to know what's happening behind the scenes of your campaign. Your team members have been engaging in highly unethical and possibly illegal activities. The attached documents speak for themselves. I trust you'll take this seriously." I hit send and smiled. Step one was complete. Step two was more personal. Rachel didn't know it yet, but her comfortable life was about to crumble. The day after I sent the email, I met with a divorce lawyer, someone discreet but ruthless. I laid everything out: the affair, the finances, the burner phone, and the possible legal implications of her involvement in Chad's schemes. The lawyer assured me that with this mountain of evidence, I had the upper hand. I could protect our shared assets and ensure that Rachel would walk away with as little as possible. But I didn't stop there. I also drafted a letter to the pharmaceutical company whose logo I'd seen on those black boxes. I included photos from the venue and detailed descriptions of the payments that had flowed through their supposed consultants. I knew this would hit them where it hurt. No corporation wants their name tied to a political scandal, especially when they're already under public scrutiny. If Rachel and Chad had been counting on these shady deals to boost their careers, they were about to learn how quickly that kind of support disappears when the spotlight turns sour. Then came the hardest part: waiting. Rachel continued her daily routines, completely unaware that her world was about to collapse. I played the part of the clueless husband perfectly, nodding along to her stories about campaign events and Chad's brilliant leadership. It was almost amusing, watching her live in her little bubble of lies while I held the pin that was about to burst it. The fallout came faster than I expected. 2 days after I sent the email to Evan Gray's team, the news broke. A local journalist, clearly tipped off by the campaign, published an expose on the shady financial dealings of Gray's campaign staff. The article detailed everything: questionable donations, secret meetings, and the involvement of individuals tied to the pharmaceutical industry. Chad's name was plastered across every headline, along with phrases like embezzlement and potential criminal charges. And right there in the article was Rachel's name, listed as a key figure in coordinating these unethical activities. I watched her read the article over breakfast. Her face turned pale, her hands shaking as she scrolled through the story. "This is insane," she muttered. "They're blowing it all out of proportion." I said nothing, just sipped my coffee and savored the moment. The phone calls started pouring, and almost immediately, Chad called her first. I could hear his panicked voice even through the phone. Then came Evan's team, furious and demanding answers. By the end of the day, Rachel was a wreck. She tried to act like everything was fine, telling me it was just a misunderstanding and that it would blow over. But I knew better. The real hammer dropped when she received a notice from the campaign's legal team, formally terminating her volunteer position and threatening her with legal action if she didn't cooperate with their investigation. Chad, of course, threw her under the bus in record time, claiming she'd handled all the questionable transactions. I almost felt bad for her, almost. The final blow came when I handed her the divorce papers. I'll never forget the look on her face when she saw my signature at the bottom, along with the attached list of evidence I planned to present in court. You've been spying on me?" she stammered, her voice cracking. "No," I said calmly. "I've been protecting myself." She tried to plead with me, to explain, to justify everything she'd done. But I didn't care anymore. She'd made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. As for Chad, last I heard, he'd left town to avoid the media circus, his political career in shambles. Rachel moved in with her sister while the divorce was finalized, and I stayed in the house, finally enjoying the quiet. They say revenge doesn't solve anything, but let me tell you, watching the two of them go down in flames was the most satisfying thing I've ever experienced. And if you're wondering whether I regret any of it, not one bit.